Morning, A people, and happy Monday. We hope you had a good rest over the few holidays last week. And we would like to officially welcome everyone to the Risk Awareness Month 2023 or RAM 2023. I'm Joyce Galura from the AUV Risk Management Team, and I will be your host for this morning. Let's kick off RAM 2023 with a learning session on risk management for non risk managers. Hopefully, this will equip each and every A person the essential and practical knowledge that will allow everyone to contribute effectively to the risk management efforts within their respective roles and ultimately to the actualization of the Aboitiz Group's conglomerate transformation. Please remember, do not hesitate to ask questions through the Q&A panel and interact with the other participants via the Zoom chat. And to share insights and help us a better grasp of risk management, we invited one of our partners from Aon. He has an undergraduate degree in economics, postgraduate studies in business administration from the Auckland University, and further training at the New England Complex Systems Institute. He also started his career managing safety risk in the commercial aviation industry and in recent years has focused on the enterprise level risk for corporates. He also has over 12 years of experience assessing and managing risk and has worked with a huge range of organizations across the Asia Pacific region. Currently, he is the principal risk consultant at Aon and a board member for the New England Risk Management Society. In his personal life, he enjoys some kind of risk taking activities or hobbies such as kickboxing, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, MMA, free diving, rock climbing, and raising his three daughters. I think his risk appetite is way up there. So, A people, please welcome Matt Bilderbeck from Aon. Good morning, Matt, and thank you for joining us today.
Good morning. Thanks, Joyce. Pleasure to be here. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for making the time to join this session, Risk for Non-Risk Managers. You're actually all risk managers, otherwise it's pretty unlikely that you would be alive today and able to join this call. Risk management is about survival, firstly, but it's also about better decisions and better performance. It's not just about having a risk management plan. That's important, but it's about day-to-day personal and business decisions that we make. It's thinking what could go wrong and how to avoid that, of course, but it's also about recognizing our own biases, how to make decisions when we don't fully understand the world that we live in because it's very complex, and how to identify the opportunity and use that platform of risk management to grasp and exploit that opportunity. I'll start by talking through the first rule of risk management. I'll briefly explain what I believe that is as a first step, and I'll use a short story. If you've read books by Nassim Taleb, you might have heard this story. So here's a farmer and his turkeys, and this farmer shows unconditional care and compassion to his turkeys. There is a loving, trusting, symbiotic relationship between the two. Every day, the farmer gives the turkeys food, and they grow bigger, stronger, smarter. Now, these turkeys obviously believe that they are onto a good thing. The turkeys have decided to gather data and plot their interactions with the farmer as a way of confirming this. So on this graph, we have gain and pain on the vertical axis and time across the horizontal axis. And this data shows that every day the turkeys gain a little bit from the farmer. Consistent, solid, predictable returns. You and I might be a little more realistic. We're starting to think maybe these turkeys might not get the full picture, but there's a twist. by consuming the nutrient-dense food provided by the farmer, they've actually become highly sophisticated. This one even has a PhD, and they've developed projections based on the data they collect. The turkeys are looking forward to the end of the year with a high degree of confidence. But unfortunately, their projections don't account for uncertainty or risk. They were subject to a lack of knowledge and several types of biases like the status quo bias, and they probably didn't appreciate the complexity of the wider system that they were part of. So things didn't turn out so well for the turkeys. They got hit by an existential risk event. Now, while it was obvious to us, nothing whatsoever in the turkeys' experience could have pointed towards this happening. And that's the problem of induction that we have to grapple with as risk managers. It only takes one future event to disprove theories based on many, many past observations over many years. So ironically, the point right before the end of the year was when the turkeys' confidence was at its very highest. They had more evidence than ever that the farmer was a benevolent caregiver. So it's a lot easier said than done because there is a lot outside our knowledge that can upset our plans. But the first rule of risk management is don't be a turkey. Survive, then thrive. Take care of the downside, and that provides a platform for us to start exploring the upside of life or business. Onto the business case for risk management. So we need to start with some basic definitions. Wikipedia defines risk as the possibility of something bad happening. The Oxford Dictionary defines it as the possibility of loss, injury, or other adverse circumstances. And the definition that I prefer is the ISO 31000 definition, which is the international standard on risk management, the effect of uncertainty on objectives. And when we take this definition, we see that risk and its impacts can be negative or positive. And it can have different aspects such as financial, safety, environmental, and it can apply at different levels, personal, strategic, operational, or project levels. Leading on then to what is the definition of risk management? Well, there are two global definitions here, and Aboitiz may well have its own definition also. The first definition, again, from ISO 31000 is the protection and creation of value. I find that a short, simple definition. The COSO definition is a little more in depth. It's a process. We'll skip some parts, risk appetite, objectives. Those are some key words there. We won't go through the whole definition, but some key points from that definition are it must be an embedded process. That means it's part of day-to-day activities. It's not something you just do once a year. Risk management is everyone's responsibility. It's not just the risk committee or the risk team. And risk appetite is another essential part of risk management in a corporate setting. And I will discuss that concept a little later on. So Aon, where I work, recognizes the importance of risk management, and we've actually invested in a global research program. This consists of a couple of data sets that we've developed. Firstly, the Global Risk Management Survey, and we're going to release a report on this later in the year. If you get a chance, you should definitely have a read of that. But this summarizes executive perceptions on the top risks for industries based on thousands of responses from the largest companies around the world. We also have the Risk Maturity Index, and this is a huge questionnaire on corporate risk management practices, culture, governance, and it's been completed by thousands of organizations. So again, there's a large database which we can analyze and compare risk management practices with overall performance. Now, the image on the right shows the 9 characteristics of risk management. This is essentially what good looks like. So just to pick out a couple of those, high level commitment. You can expect that from your senior leadership. Culture of risk ownership, that means you personally have a part to play in driving the culture of risk ownership when you're going through the risk process. And stakeholder participation, when you are identifying and managing risks, it's always helpful to get stakeholder involvement. So later on, I'll give an example of a project that I was involved in that highlights just a couple of these key areas. What is the business case? Well, the business case is risk management drives better performance. So firstly, yes, we use risk management to survive by thinking about what we might not know, what could go wrong, by understanding our biases and considering the effects of complexity. But once we're good at that, we start using risk management to reach for higher heights. And the research summarized here shows that companies with better risk management have better share price performance, improved growth, reduced volatility. Further research shows that companies in the top 20% of risk management capability are generating 3 times the level of EBITDA as those in the bottom 20%. We've also found correlations between better risk management and better insurance premium outcomes. And on top of that, various stakeholders simply require us to have best practice risk management, whether these be shareholders or regulators. So the case is strong, and I'd like to further articulate that with a case study that I was involved with several years ago. Now, Queenstown is, I'm from New Zealand, and Queenstown is a top tourist destination in New Zealand. And part of what makes this area spectacular and popular is that it's nestled in amongst the Southern Alps. But this factor also makes it quite a hard place to access. So when you fly into Queenstown, you fly through a valley of mountains quite close on either side of you. And historically, the flights were only allowed during daylight hours. Now, being quite far south of the equator, daylight hours in winter were actually very limited. So this had a huge constraint on how many flights go into the region, and this was a massive economic limitation for the airport and for the region. So we embarked on a 4-year risk management project to figure out how to enable flights into Queenstown during both day and night. Now, picking out a couple of those key characteristics, like stakeholder engagement, we worked with technical pilots for 4 competing airlines. We had them all in the same room. I worked with air traffic control, the airport, and the regulator. Data and analytics, we analyzed historical incidents, flight data, weather data, comparable airports. Risk quantification, we quantified the exposure, understanding the limitations of that, so that the regulator could compare this against defined criteria. And ultimately, the outcome of this piece of work was we developed a very large package of risk mitigations, and these included expanding airport infrastructure, a wider runway, new lighting configuration, operational mitigation, special pilot training and flight processes. So this image shows the technology used to essentially create highways in the sky, and the aircraft flies through that defined area. And so this overall program of risk management and the outcomes enabled the airport to then expand its terminal, take more flights, and enable more tourists to visit the region, not just national, but international tourists. So for me, this is a really good example of risk management being an enabler for better performance and better outcomes. And I'll share a video relating to this project later on. But perhaps from an Aboitiz perspective, we can think about risk management as an enabler for allowing you to enter into new sectors, maybe sectors that don't fully understand, or your competitors might be too conservative to enter. And in this way, risk management can actually become a competitive advantage for you. I mentioned the concept of risk appetite, and this is really important in corporate organizations because every individual has a different personal risk appetite. And if we each follow our own personal risk appetite, then we end up making quite inconsistent decisions as an organization. And I'll demonstrate this on the next slide. So we're going to show a 1 to 10 scale. Now, hopefully most of you are quite okay with the first few on this list. Sleeping, walking, driving, swimming, even a little bit of hiking. And as we go through, please just have a think about what category you would see yourself in. We have surfing, whitewater rafting, bungee jumping, cliff diving, and ultimately at number 10, free solo climbing. I don't know if you've seen the documentary, but quite spectacular. So I'll give my personal example. I would do, and I have done the whitewater rafting, and I would say that therefore any activity 7 or below, I'd call that my green zone. If I'm in the green zone, I'm quite okay to keep doing what I'm doing. But then the next level up, we have the amber zone. For me, this would be bungee jumping and cliff diving. And ultimately, I would like to avoid these things. I don't have a particular desire to do them. But if you paid me enough money, then potentially I would give it a go. So if we're in the amber zone in a corporate sense, what we have to ask is this worth it? And if the answer is yes, we can keep doing that activity as long as we pay close attention and manage the risks well. If we're in the red zone, for me, that's free solo climbing. Doesn't matter how much you pay me, I'm not going to risk my life like that. So we just have to act immediately to reduce the risk. And a final point, if all we're doing is sleeping in the green zone, we might need to challenge ourselves to actually take more risk. So this is a really important concept for corporates, and I'd encourage you to talk to your risk team about AUV's risk appetite and try and keep that in mind when making business decisions. Identifying and managing risks. This is the part of risk management where we think about what could go wrong and we try and stop that from happening. So many people aren't aware there's a defined risk process, which is part of the international standard I mentioned. It's a very simple process, but it has been developed over many years and tested in industries like aviation, offshore oil drilling, space exploration. So quite simply, the process is we define the context, we identify, analyze, and evaluate and treat the risk. And throughout this process, we communicate with people. And I'll give a really simple example of how to start identifying risks. We take any activity, in this case, driving our car to work. Remember, we mentioned objectives at the start of the presentation. So the objective here is really important. We want to arrive on time and at a reasonable cost. Sometimes people find it difficult to start saying, well, what are the risks associated with this objective? So my suggestion is we can start identifying success factors. Okay, we can list things that help us achieve that objective. Things like leaving home on time, accessing the car, driving the car. And what happens when we flip those around, they effectively become our risks. So take the example of successfully driving the car. Well, the flip side of that could be having a collision. And once we've identified that risk, it's helpful to define the risk in a consistent way using a risk statement. We use this template, a risk of an event caused by causes leading to consequences controlled by various controls. And I'll give a visual example of that template. We have the event with a collision in the middle. This is called a bow tie diagram. We have causes down the left side, things like distraction, weather, mechanical failure, other drivers, maybe you feel the need to ram someone off the road to assert your dominance. And we have preventative controls. You know, we have sleep, regular car service, maybe some anger management just to treat the other drivers a little bit kinder. And then we have mitigative controls after an event. These are the car safety features, airbags, for example. And finally, we have the impact, right? Like potentially injury or being late to work, repair costs, reputation. If you drive a particular way, next time you offer someone a ride, they might say, no, it's okay. And that's just them being scared to drive with you. So this is a helpful way of looking at risk. It makes us describe the controls in detail, and encourage us to actually do something about the risk. Cognitive biases can really trip us up when we're trying to identify and manage risks. You can find this image on Wikipedia. Don't expect to be able to read all the text on here. It's far too small. But our brains take a lot of shortcuts. For example, we edit and reinforce some memories after the fact. We're drawn to details that confirm our own existing beliefs. We simplify probabilities and numbers to make them easier to think about. Here's a further list of some of the biases that I think are most impactful for identifying and managing risks. We have the status quo bias. We think that things will always stay the same. We think that the risk from last time will be the risk for next time. Confirmation bias. We don't like being wrong. We seek out information that confirms our existing beliefs. And look, political opinions are great for observing confirmation bias. And if you're an external viewer, say for us, and maybe we're looking at somewhere like the US, we see people doubling down on their beliefs when questioned rather than ever actually questioning their beliefs on both sides. We have groupthink bias, and a lot of risk management is done with a group of people in the room. But have you guys seen the experiments done where there's a person in a waiting room at, say, a doctor's, and there's 5 other people in the room, but all those 5 other people are actors. And suddenly smoke starts coming out from underneath a door. And the person who's not an actor looks to the others for some sort of validation, but they don't give it. They're intentionally not giving it. So many times, the one person who's not an actor just sits there, and they're willing to sit in a building that's on fire rather than to go against the group. Availability bias. We tend to draw on the closest or most recent information available, again, fundamentally because our brains are lazy and we don't want to have to look further for information. Anchoring bias. If you're ever negotiating to buy something, start by offering a very ridiculously low price, because that anchors our expectations about what the value is, regardless of where the number comes from. We find it really hard to depart from an initial number. And finally, hindsight bias. So the saying is hindsight is 20/20. And this leads us to say, well, this risk event was obvious. We should have seen it coming. Therefore, we'll definitely see the next thing coming, so we don't have to worry about it. So we started talking about identifying and managing risk. We talked about how our biases can cloud our ability to do that. But another thing that can hinder our ability to identify and manage risks is complexity. Driving to work was a very linear example. It's quite simple. It's about getting from point A to point B. But not everything is simple, and some things are very complex. Complex systems are all around us. They include conglomerates, economic systems, transport systems, the human body, the environment. And these complex systems are breeding grounds for risks, new, interesting, unforeseen risks. And we simply can't predict all of those risks, but we can acknowledge when we're dealing with complexity, and we can be aware and use processes from nature to help us manage the unknown. So 2 key things that define complex systems, amongst others, but these are nonlinear responses and interdependencies. So what do we mean by nonlinear responses? Well, if you double the dose of a medication, it doesn't make the medication twice as effective. It might be much more effective, or it might be less effective, or it might cause an overdose. Same thing if you own a factory and you double the amount of people that you hire. Doesn't mean you're going to double your production. You might crowd the place and actually drastically reduce production. So these effects are nonlinear responses. Nonlinear responses in life are incredibly common, and probably more common than linear responses. And someone has once said that talking about nonlinear phenomena is like talking about non-elephant animals. The linear is very much the exception. We also have interdependencies. Pushing on a complex system over here has effects way over there because the parts are interdependent. So compare that with a simple contraption that has a clear cause and effect. If I flick on a switch here, the light turns over there, and there's no room for ambiguity. But when we talk about interdependencies, think ecosystems and food chains. If you remove one species, it can disrupt the whole food chain, causing side effects that you never would have envisaged. And many man-made systems have similar characteristics. So we're more connected than ever, especially technologically today. So the effects of interdependencies are far more pronounced. Now, when we acknowledge that we are in a complex environment, it can be helpful to think about risk management in a slightly different way. And we can strive to make ourselves, our teams, company, our country more resilient. So I mentioned we could use tactics from nature, and the term resilience actually comes from biology and originally applied to species and population dynamics. The definition we use in an organizational sense is the ability of systems to resist, absorb, and recover from or adapt to adverse occurrences. This might not be a popular way of viewing it, but I love fighting as a sport, and I like to think about resilience in terms of a fight. So step one, resist. That's our defense techniques, prevents us from being hit. We limit exposure, we keep our guard up. We're all the way in or we're all the way out. We don't stand in range where we can get hit. That's resisting. Step two is acknowledging that, well, we probably will get hit if we're in a fight. We don't know when, we don't necessarily know how, but we need to be able to absorb a punch. And if we train our bodies, they'll be strong, they'll be more able to take an impact. Think about a business, a strong balance sheet makes that company more robust. Project contingency allocations in a project mean we're more robust to an external shock, even when we don't know what that shock will be. Step three, recover from bad situations. What happens if I end up on the ground? In a mixed martial arts fight, the fight continues. So now I have to escape from someone on top of me, but I'm only going to be able to do that if I've planned and practiced for worst case scenarios. And step four is adapt. When I get back on my feet, am I going to do exactly the same thing that I did before? I'll try and learn from the situation and try something different. I'll perhaps use some of my other techniques, or if it's really that bad, you know what, I might just pack up and try a different sport. I'm going to use a couple of my hobbies to represent two further decision types or risk types. Now, the first hobby here is spearfishing. Now, for those who aren't aware, this is when you hold your breath and dive underwater and you're carrying a spear gun, which you will use to shoot a fish that you will then take home to your family for dinner. If the process sounds a little barbaric, it's actually very sustainable because you can be very selective about what the fish is that you want. And if you're like me, you're just going to miss anyway, so no fish are harmed in the process. But sometimes I find myself thinking, I'm diving 10 to 15 meters underwater. I'm risking blackout because I'm holding my breath and potential drowning. If I'm successful, I'm going to shoot something that will bleed and thrash about, attracting sharks. So there's a lot of downside for the upside of a fish. And the diagram below the image shows this. Lots of downside, limited upside. Second hobby, which I've just started recently, is bouldering. Now this is rock climbing, but the walls are only about 4 meters high and there's foam mats on the ground. So they literally remove the downside of free solo climbing. And what this means is you can give things a go. You can try the beginner climbs or the advanced climbs. You can have a go at doing a Tom Cruise Mission Impossible style leap of faith. And if you fail, it's just no big deal. If you succeed, you get eternal glory. So low downside and potentially unlimited upside. Now, as a technology company, think about investing a small amount in a new technological solution. If it has no benefits, you've only invested a small amount, but on the upside, it could have exponential growth potential. So recapping again, we use risk management to seek out or create situations that have more upside than downside. First, we have to survive. Think about what we might not know, what could go wrong, and we should strive to understand our biases. We need to consider the effects of complexity, but we should also think about ways to be resilient in the face of complexity. And ultimately, we want to use risk management to take away the downside so that we can pursue opportunities with a high upside. So thank you for listening to my presentation. It's a real privilege to be talking to you. I'm going to play a short 4-minute video of the approach to Queenstown Airport, which I mentioned at the very start of the presentation. Look, if anyone needs to drop off, that's fine. But if you think of any questions while the video is playing, please feel free to hang around. The video is about 4 minutes, and then ask me any questions in the remaining few minutes.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Matt, for giving us an overview of risk management and even its practical applications. I like the comparison of the risk appetite to various activities from sleeping to that solo trekking, rock climbing. So definitely, even if you pay me for that, I wouldn't take that risk, no. So because that's also in the red zone. So for all of us A people, let us remember that risk management ultimately enhances our decision making, fosters innovation, and leads to organizational and even personal growth. So now, Matt, we have some questions from our audience. And the first one is from an anonymous attendee. Though. So there's a thank you, Matt. The thought process in risk management that you provided earlier was helpful. But is it possible to know what you don't know and how? So I hope I was able to to convey that clearly. The question.
Good question. Thank you. Is it possible to know what you don't know? Look,
No, and
um,
how?
and how? Um, I believe that it's probably impossible to know what you don't know, but you can be aware of what you can't know, and you can really focus on the limitations that we talked about. For example, some of the biases that we're subject to. You can learn about some of the statistical limitations that find their way into decision making. So that's probably the best we can do. And then you can basically prepare for the unknown as well.
Uh, all right. Thank you for that, Matt. Another question is that risk appetite varies among individuals and executives. So just like what I mentioned earlier, you have a very different risk appetite compared to me and to others. How can you encourage them to increase their risk appetite and achieve more for the long term? Sorry, I missed the varies among individuals and executives. So how can we encourage them to increase this appetite and achieve more for the long term?
Yeah, great question. And I believe the answer is it starts with the tone at the top and basically describing and articulating the risk appetite that the board, that senior executives want people within the organization to have, and then empowering them with those green, amber, red zones, and really encouraging them to take the according amount of risk.
For the organization. Agree. And then another question. Okay, so we have a lot of questions, Matt. So how do you see risk management being applied to stakeholder engagement?
Yeah, interesting question. So stakeholder engagement is part of the risk management process. So when we're assessing risk, we should definitely try and engage with our stakeholders. Now, if you're talking about stakeholder engagement as its own activity, well, I think the risk process that we described should apply to that. We've got to start with what are the objectives, what can affect our ability to meet those objectives as we're engaging with external stakeholders on any given matter.
Right. Uh, okay. And then another, sorry, Matt, another question here. What is the best way to integrate risk management to one's self and not just at work alone? Aside, I think, from the examples that you provided earlier compared to various activities, how else can we apply risk management personally?
Yeah, great question. And that's where my interest in risk management started, actually. I mean, some suggestions would be to try out new activities, learn about the risks of those activities by having some skin in the game. And once you've actually had some skin in the game, then the motivation to manage risks and understand the risk becomes quite high. If you're
Yeah.
minded to read books, there's some fantastic books as well available, and I could provide some comments on those as well.
Yeah, I agree. Experience is the best teacher, as they say. So I'll think about trying one of those dangerous activities you mentioned earlier. So another question here is, how important is domain knowledge in risk management And how do you prepare or augment a possible lack of experience or knowledge in the industry you are doing risk management with? That's a tough one.
Yeah, it is a tough question. It's a great question, and
Great
the
question.
initial response that I have is domain knowledge is really important in risk management. And if we go back to that risk management process, then the first step is establishing the context, and that's understanding the internal and external factors that can influence our ability to meet objectives. So
All right. And then next question, going to gain or pain or time as the time progresses recently, surviving pandemic and recession, what could be the most talk about risks across industries? Yeah, based on your interactions with your different clients, stakeholders, without, of course, naming your specific clients.
yeah, that's an excellent question. And uh, while I could point to some of the top risks, I'd encourage a little bit of patience and wait for the Global Risk Management Survey report that should be out later this month, and that will be the most up to date um, view of the top risks across industries as gathered from thousands of executives around the world. But no doubt we're going to see things like cyber risk up there um, as an example.
Okay. Thanks for that, Matt. And then another question is, how can emerging technologies such as AI be applied in risk management? Interesting
Oh,
question also.
great
Yes.
question. Yeah, and we're still finding out, I guess, is the answer. But certainly, I can imagine that AI could be used to sort of source additional information for us and test our assumptions and create scenarios that we haven't thought about.
Right. Agree. Um, Another question here. If you have conflicting risk appetites between two parties or partners, is this speaking from experience? How can you manage them to secure a common agreement? What would you advise them on how they can manage, if there are conflicting risk appetites, which I think is pretty common, right? As I've mentioned, your risk appetite is different from mine and different from another person I'm here within the room. So what would you advise? Um,
Excellent, excellent question. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty hard if people have two individual types of risk appetite. Maybe it's putting forward the idea that this is not your individual risk appetite. This is um, an organizational risk appetite, but then addressing the fears that underlie that. And it comes back to obviously encouraging people, it comes back to a just culture, which is, you know, enabling people to sort of put their hands up if there is a mistake or if they're uncomfortable and not be punished.
yeah, and I agree. One more question. In your practice, how do you apply risk management in projects and change management? This is also similar to another question. Do you have any book or book recommendations or any references that you can refer to us?
Yeah, of course. Look, one of the book reference recommendations is a book called Risk Savvy, and that's great to learn about personal risk, like personal health risks.
Oh.
And I'm not going to try and pronounce the name of the author. It's quite a difficult name, but Risk Savvy is the name of the book.
All
There's
right.
another book called Making Things Work uh, by the Complex Systems Institute, and then the books by Nassim Taleb are quite interesting too.
I think
Things like the
also for
Black Swan.
right. And then here, hi, Matt. Thank you for very insightful sharings. In terms of risk management, would you recommend coming up with a risk register to plot out potential risk and potential impacts prior to pursuing a certain project?
Yeah, that's generally a good idea. What you need to consider is the size of the project and at what phase you are. Um, certainly if it's a large project and you're very close to starting, or making a big decision, then you should probably create a risk register and quite a detailed one. But there may be smaller decisions where risk management can be a conversation. You can talk about the risks. You can go through the process without having it be so formal and so time consuming.
Right. Agree. This one is, I think, related to culture. So, how can non-risk managers contribute to a culture of risk awareness and mitigation within an organization?
Yeah, it's look, asking about the risks, talking about the risks and the opportunities, understanding your role, like your activities undoubtedly are contributing to risk mitigation. So understanding if there are particular risks that you're responsible for. Yeah, great question.
Right. Thanks, Matt. And then another question here is, um, political and regulatory risks are some of the biggest risks faced in the infrastructure sector. Some of these risks even become existential. What are the good ways to think about managing these risks?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question, and I don't know if I can go into all the all the ways now, but really that's a risk process for you to own and to define those objectives and come up with the risks and think about how you're managing them.
And then what would you consider as top three things that can move the needle between compliance to really proactively embracing risk management in an organization?
Yeah, excellent question. I'll list some things. I don't know if there's three, but I mean, people certainly see risk as compliance because often that's all they see. So really engaging people in the risk process and deep dive risk assessments is one of the things, and also making risk part of everyday conversations as well. That non-formal risk management, treating it as focused on specific decisions. And like I said before, it could be just a conversation about the risks.
Yes. And it that conversation should just be, we keep on going on for those conversations. Another question is, how important is the role of the risk champions in managing the risk in the group? So they're not necessarily formally risk managers, but they are the risk POCs in a department or in a business unit. So how, for you, or what can you share on how important their role is?
Yeah, I think it's a great idea, and having a centralized risk team is fantastic. But those people can't reach out to every single person, so having additional leaders and coordinators for risk is really important.
And they're really valued as well, and they, for the risk teams, they are also considered our partners, in terms of risk management. um, how would you manage the risk of losing people in a scenario where your organization needs to transition, but some people are not prepared to operationalize the transition due to lack of experience and knowledge? Would you rather onboard new people with relevant skills than training existing people? People
Yeah,
risk.
it's a really fine line to walk, isn't it? Because there's a lot to invest in developing people, but also there can be implications of losing people. So this is where that tone from the top and having some clear guidance on how to manage that should help make the trade-off, and recognizing that there's a trade-off, and managing that as carefully as you can.
Right. Agree on that, Matt. And then how do you convince people to take risk management more seriously? Um, can you share an example of where have you done so? So I think this is something to do with, like, risk management is a tick in a box exercise. It's more of a compliance exercise. So how do we convince people that it's not just type of exercise, or to
Yeah,
take it more seriously?
I mean, stories are a great way to convince people, although to be honest, some of my stories were not so serious. So I'm not sure about those, but stories of successes and failures, and also people having skin in the game as well, where they have something to gain or lose from the risk, and that really wakes people up.
Right. And then another question. Is this ano ba? So can you share an example of a situation where where you have had to recommend implementing contingency plans or risk management measures that you knew would be unpopular? How did you go about doing that? This is also an
Yeah,
interest. We have a lot of interesting questions today, Matt.
fantastic questions. I do recall an example where a major a project was meant to go ahead in the upcoming construction season, and we actually did realize that there was some quite significant risk associated. It was an airport construction project, significant risk associated with the aviation operations. So we did have to talk with the board of an airline and airport and actually suggest that it get delayed in New Zealand because of our climate. It was delayed a whole year. So that was a difficult conversation. But I think ultimately, when people recognize the potential consequences and reputational impacts, those people were on board with making the change.
I think like what you mentioned earlier, having that conversation, and then just weighing the pros and cons, I think ultimately both parties will agree, even if it's unpopular measure or plan. And then I think this would be the last question. What do you think is the most critical part of assessing the entity's enterprise risk management process in addressing emerging risks?
Now, that's a good question. What do you think is the most critical part of
Of
assessing
assessing the
entities?
entity's enterprise risk management process in addressing emerging risks?
Yeah, I mean, emerging risks are interesting because they're risks that aren't really clearly defined yet. You can't quite say this is what the
Mhm.
risk is, but you know that there's something out there. So I think the best way of dealing with emerging risks is monitoring. It's looking ahead, and it's being a little bit creative as well.
All right. We still have a few questions, but I think that's all the um time that we have today. So thank you very much, Matt, for sharing your insights. We learned a lot so much today, and we appreciate the practical applications. Hopefully, everyone will remember how you described, especially the risk appetite, no, in our everyday lives. So we would like to thank everyone who joined us today. And we would like to take this opportunity to invite everyone to the rest of the RAM 2023 learning sessions. So for each week of November, we'll be featuring one area of risk management. For this week, we are focused on enterprise risk management. For the week of November 13 to 17, it will be business continuity week. We'll have learning sessions on resiliency beyond IT disaster recovery and supply chain resiliency. For the week of November 20 to 24, we'll be focusing on risk finance. We'll have a learning session on practical insurance for everyone and behavioral based road safety for everyone as well. So we hope you can also join us for those upcoming sessions. And as we mentioned, this is a month long celebration, so please stay tuned for any other activities that we may be sending across the group, for the rest of November. And thank you, everyone, and for your feedback. Flashed on your screen is a QR code where you can provide your feedback. And the first five attendees who will send the feedback will receive a prize from the risk management team. Okay, so please don't hesitate to provide your feedback there. All right. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. And we hope to see you in the next Learning Lunes sessions. Thank you and good morning.
Thank you, everyone.
Alright. Wait lang, hindi pa tayo